Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we continue in The Well at the World's End, a tale by William Morris. We are on Book 3, Chapter 15, entitled They Come to the Land of the Innocent Folk. When it was morning, they speedily got them ready for the road, whereas they had little to take with them. So they departed joyously, howbeit both Ralph and Ursula felt rather love than loathing for their winter abode. The day was yet young when they went their ways. Their horses and all their gear were a great wonder to the young men, for they had seen no such beasts before. But the elder said that once in his young days he had led a man to the well who was riding a horse, and was clad in a knightly array. So they went by ways which were nowise dreadful, though they were void of menfolk, and in 3 days' time they were come out of the mountains. And in 3 more the said mountains were to behold but a cloud behind them, and the land was grown goodly with fair valleys and little hills, though still they saw no men, and forsooth they went leisurely, for oxen are but slow-going nags. But when they were gone 8 days from the valley of the sweet chestnuts, they came across a flock of uncouth-looking sheep on a green hillside, and 4 folk shepherding them. 2 carles to wit, and 2 queans, like to their way leaders, but scarce so goodly, and ruder of raiment. These men greeted them kindly, and yet with more worship than fellowship, and they marveled exceedingly at their horses and weapons. Thence they passed on, and the next day came into a wide valley, well grassed and watered, and wooded here and there. Moreover, there were cotes scattered about it. There and thenceforth they met men at many, both carles and queans, and sheep and neatly in plenty. And they passed by garths, wherein the young corn was waxing, and vineyards on the hillsides where the vines were beginning to grow green. The land seemed as goodly as might be, and all the folk they met were kind, if somewhat over-reverent. On the evening of that day they came into the town of that folk, which was but simple and wholly unfenced for war, and the houses but low and not great. Yet was there not a filth or famine, nor any poverty or misery. And the people were merry-faced, and well-liking, and clad goodly after their fashion in white woolen cloth or frieze. All the people of the town were come forth to meet them, for runners had gone before them, and they stood on either side of the way murmuring greetings, and with their heads bent low in reverence. Thus rode Ralph and Ursula up to the door of the temple, or moat house, or guest house, for it was all these, a house great, and as fair as they knew how to make it. Before the door thereof were standing the elders of the folk, and when they drew rein, the eldest and most revered of these came forth and spake in a cheerful voice, yet solemnly, Welcome, and thrice welcome to the seekers after length of days and happy times, and the loving kindness of the folks of the earth. Then all the elders gathered about them, and bade them light down and be at rest among them. And they made much of them, and brought them into the moat house, wherein there were both women and men fair and stately. And the men took Ralph by the hand, and the women Ursula, and brought them into chambers where they bathed them, and did off their wayfaring raiment, and clad them in white woolen gowns of web exceeding fine, and fragrant withal. Then they crowned them with flowers, and led them back into the hall, whereas now was much folk gathered, and they set them down on a dais, as though they had been kings, or rather gods. And when they beheld them there so fair and lovely, they cried out for joy of them, and bade them hail and oft. There then were they feasted by that kind folk, and when meat was done, certain youths and maidens fell to singing songs very sweetly. And the words of the songs were simple and harmless, and concerning the fairness of the earth, and the happy loves of the creatures that dwell therein. Thereafter, as the night aged, they were shown to a sleeping chamber, which, albeit not richly decked or plenished with precious things, was most dainty clean, and sweet-smelling, and strown with flowers, so that the night was sweet to them in a chamber of love. Chapter 16. They come to the house of the sorceress. On the morrow the kind people delayed them little, though they sorrowed for their departure, and before noon were their old way leaders ready for them, And the old man and his 2 grandsons, for such they were much honored of the simple people for their way leading of the heavenly folk. For so they called Ralph and Ursula. So they gat them to the way in such like guise as before, only they had with them 5 sumpter oxen instead of 2. For the old man told them that not only was their way longer, but also they must needs pass through a terrible waste, wherein was naught for their avail, neither man nor beast, nor herb. Even so they found it, as he said, for after the first day's ride from the town they came to the edge of this same waste, and on the 4th day were deep in the heart of it. A desert it was, rather rocky and stony and sandy than mountainous, though they had hills to cross also. Withal there was but little water there, and that foul and stinking. Long lasted this waste, and Ralph thought indeed that it had been hard to cross, had not their way-leaders been. Therefore he made marks and signs by the wayside, and took note of the bearing of rocks and mounds against the day of return. 12 days they rode this waste, and on the 13th it began to mend somewhat, and there was a little grass, and sweet waters. And they saw ahead the swelling hills of great woodland, albeit they had to struggle through marshland and low scrubby thicket for a day longer, or ever they got to the aforesaid trees, which are at first naught but pines. But these failed in a while, and they rode a grass waste, nearly treeless, but somewhat well watered, where they gat them good store of venison. Thereafter they came on woods of oak and sweet chestnut, with here and there a beech wood. Long and long they rode the woodland, but it was hard on May when they entered it. And it was pleasant therein, and what with one thing, what with another, they had abundant livelihood there. Yet was June at its full, when at last they came within sight of the house of the sorceress, on the hottest of a fair afternoon, and it was even as Ralph had seen it pictured in the arras of the hall of the Castle of Abundance, a little house built after the fashion of houses in his own land of the west. The thatch was trim, and the windows and doors were unbroken, and the garth was whole, and the goats feeding therein, and the wheat was tall and blossoming in the little closes, whereas he had looked to see all broken down and wild. And as to the house, a mere grass-grown heap, or at the most a broken gable fast crumbling away. Then waxed his heart sore with the memory of that past time and the sweetness of his short-lived love, though he refrained from all he might. Yet forsooth Ursula looked on him anxiously, so much his face was changed by the thought of his heart. But the elder of the way-leaders saw that he was moved, and deemed that he was wondering at that house so trim and orderly amidst the wildwood. So he said, "Here also do we after our behest to that marvellous and lovely lady, that we suffer not this house to go to ruin. Ever are some of our folk here, and every year about this season we send 2 or more to take the place of those who have dwelt in the house year long. So ever is there someone to keep all things trim. But as to strangers, I have never in my life seen any seeker of the well herein saved once, and that was an old whore man like me, save that he was feebler in all wise than I be." Now Ralph heard him talking, yet he noted his words but little, for it was with him as if all grief of heart, which he had penned back for so long a while, swelled up within him and burst its bounds. And he turned towards Ursula, and their eyes met, and she looked shy and anxious on him, and he might no longer refrain himself, but put his hands to his face, for they had now drawn rein at the garth gate, and he brake out a weeping, and wept long for the friend whose feet had worn that path so often, and whose heart, though she were dead, had brought them thither for their thriving, and for love and sorrow of him. Ursula wept also. But the old man and his grandsons turned their heads away from his weeping, and got off their horses, and went up to the house door, whereby were they now standing a carle and a quean of their people. Ralph slowly got off his horse, and stood by Ursula, who was on the ground already, but he would not touch her, for he was ashamed. She looked on him kindly, and said, "Dear friend, there is no need for shame, for though I be young, I know how grievous it is when the dead that we have loved come across our ways, and we may not speak to them, nor they to us. So I will but bid thee be comforted, and abide in thy love for the living and the dead." His tears brake out again at that word, for he was but young, and for a while there was a lull in the strife that had beset his days. But after a little he looked up and dashed the tears from his eyes. He smiled on Ursula and said, "The tale she told me of this place, the sweetness of it came back upon me, and I might not forbear." She said, "O friend, thou art kind, and I love thee." So then they joined hands and went through the garth together, and up to the door where stood the wardens, who, when they saw them turning thither, came speedily down the path to them. And the wardens would have knelt in worship to them, but they would not suffer it, but embraced and kissed them, and thanked them many times for their welcome. The said wardens, both Carl and Quien, were goodly folk of middle age, stalwart and kind of face. So then they went into the house together, and entered into the self-same chamber there of old. The Lady of Abundance had sickened for fear of the sorceress, sitting naked at her spell-work. Great joy they made together, and the warden set meat and drink before the guests. And they ate and drank, and were of good cheer. But the elder who had brought them from Chestnut Dale said, "Dear friends, I have told you that these 2 young men are my grandchildren, and they are the sons of this man and woman whom ye see. For the man is my son. And so it is that amongst us the care of the quest of the well at the world's end hath both long been the heritage of our blood, going with us from father to son. Therefore is it not wonderful, though I have been sundry times at this house, and have learned about the place all that may be learned. For my father brought me hither when I was yet a boy. That time it was that I saw the last man of whom we know for sure that he drank of the water of the well. And he was that old whore man like unto me, but as I said, far weaker in all wise. That when he came back to us from the well, he was strong and stalwart, and a better man than I am now. And I heard him tell his name to my father, that he was called the Sage of Swevenham." Ralph looked on Ursula and said, "Yea, father, and it was through him that we had our lore concerning the way hither. And it was he that bade us abide your coming in the rock house of the Vale of the Sweet Chestnuts." "Then he is alive still," said the elder. Said Ralph, "Yea, and as fair and strong an old man as you may lightly see." "Yea, yea," said the elder, "and yet 50 years ago his course seemed run." Then said Ralph, "Tell me, father, have none of your own folk sought to the well at the world's end?" "Nay, none," said the elder. Said Ralph, "That is strange, whereas ye are so nigh thereto, and have such abundant lore concerning the way." "Son," said the elder, "true it is that the water of the well shall cause a man to thrive in all ways, and to live through many generations of men, may be in honor and good liking. But it may not keep any man alive forever, for so have the gods given us the gift of death, lest we weary of life. Now our folk live well and hale, and without the sickness and pestilence, such as I have heard oft befall folk in other lands, even as I heard the Sage of Swevenham say, and I wondered at his words. Of strife and of war also we know not, nor do we desire aught which we may not easily attain to. Therefore we live long, and we fear the gods, if we should strive to live longer, lest they should bring upon us war and sickness, and overweening desire, and weariness of life. Moreover, it is little that all should seek to the well at the world's end, and those few that sought and drank should be stronger and wiser than the others, and should make themselves earthly gods, and maybe should torment the others of us, and make their lives a very burden to be borne. Of such matters are there tales current amongst us, that so it hath been of yore and in other lands, and ill it were if such times came back upon us." Ralph hung his head and was silent, for the joy of the quest seemed dying out as the old man's words dropped slowly from his mouth. But he smiled upon Ralph and went on, "But for you, guests, it is otherwise. For ye of the world beyond the mountains are stronger and more godlike than we, as all tales tell, and ye wear away your lives desiring that which ye may scarce get, and ye set your hearts on high things, desiring to be masters of the very gods. Therefore ye know sickness and sorrow, and oft ye die before your time, so that ye must depart and leave undone things which ye deem ye were born to do, which to all men is grievous. And because of all this ye desire healing and thriving, whether good come of it or ill. Therefore ye do but right to seek to the well at the world's end, that ye may the better accomplish that which behove you, and that ye may serve your fellows, and deliver them from the thraldom of those that be strong and unwise and unkind, of whom we have heard strange tales. Ralph reddened as he spake, and Ursula looked on him anxiously, but that talk dropped for the present, and they fell to talking of lighter and more familiar matters. Thereafter they wandered about the woods with the wardens and the way-leaders, and the elder brought them to the ancient altar in the wood whereon the sorceress had offered up the goat, and the how of the woman dight with the necklace of the quest, whom the lady found dead in the snow, and the place nigh the house where the sorceress used to torment her thrall that was afterwards the Lady of Abundance. Yea, and they went further afield till they came to the Vale of Lore, and the heath above it where they met, the king's son and the lady. All these and other places were now become as hallowed ground to the innocent people, and to Ralph no less. In the house, moreover, was a fair ark, wherein they kept matters which had belonged to the lady, as her shoes and her smock, wrapped in goodly cloth amidst well-smelling herbs, and these things they worshipped as folk do with relics of the saints. In another ark also they showed the seekers a book, wherein was written lore concerning the well, and the way thereto. But of this book had the sage forewarned Ralph and his mate, and had bidden them look to it that they should read in it, and no otherwhere than at that ancient altar in the wood, they two alone, and clad in such like gear as they wore when they hearkened to his reading by his hermitage. And so it was that they found the due raiment in the ark along with the book. Therefore day after day, betimes in the morning, they bore the said book to the altar, and read therein till they had learned much wisdom. Thus they did for 8 days, and on the 9th they rested and were merry with their hosts. But on the 10th day they mounted their horses, and said farewell, and departed by the ways they had learned of, they two alone. And they had with them bread and meal, as much as they might bear, and waterskins moreover, that they might fill them at the last sweet water before they came to the waterless desert. Chapter 17. They come through the woodland to the thirsty desert. So they rode their ways, and when they were come well into the wildwood past the house, and had spoken but few words to each other, Ralph put forth his hand and stayed Ursula. And they got off their horses under a great-limbed oak, and did off their armor, and sat down on the greensward there, and loved each other dearly, and wept for joy of their pain and travail in love. And afterwards, as they sat side by side leaning up against the great oak bole, Ralph spake and said, Now are we two once again all alone in the uttermost parts of the earth, and belike we are not very far from the well at the world's end. And now I have bethought me that if we gain that which we seek for, and bear back our lives to our own people, the day may come when we are grown old, for as young as we may seem, that we shall be as lonely than as we were this hour, and that the folk round about us shall be to us as much no more than these trees, and the wild things that dwell amongst them. She looked on him and laughed as one over-happy, and said, Thou runnest forward swiftly to meet trouble, beloved. But I say that well it be in those days, if I love the folk then as well as I love those trees, and the wild things whose house they are. And she rose up therewith, and threw her arms about the oak bole, and kissed its ruggedness, while Ralph, as he laid, kissed the sleekness of her feet. And there came a robin hopping over the leaves anigh them. For in that wood most of the creatures, knowing not man, were tame to him, and feared the horses of those twain more than their riders. And now as Ursula knelt to embrace Ralph with one hand, she held out the other to the said robin, who perched on her wrist. And it sat there as a hooded falcon had done, and fell to whistling his sweet notes as if he were a-talking to those newcomers. Then Ursula gave him a song reward for their broken meat, and he flew up and perched on her shoulder, and nestled up against her cheek. And she laughed happily and said, Lo, you sweet, have not the wild things understood my words, and sent this fair messenger to foretell us all good? It is good, said Ralph laughing, yet the oak tree hath not spoken yet, despite of all thy kissing. And lo, there goes thy friend the robin, now thou hast no more meat to give him. He is flying towards the well of the world's end, she said, and biddeth us onward. Let us to horse and hasten, for if thou wilt have the whole truth concerning my heart, it is this, that some chance hap may yet take thee from me ere thou hast drunk of the waters of the well. Yea, said Ralph, and in the innermost of my heart lieth the fear that may happen there is no well, and no healing in it if we find it, and that death and the backward way may yet sunder us. This is the worst of my heart, and evil is my coward fear. But she cast her arms about him, and kissed and caressed him, and cried out, Yea, then fair have been the days of our journeying, and fair this hour of the green oak, and bold and true thine heart that hath led thee thus far, and won thee the desire of my love. So then they armed them, and mounted their horses, and set forward. They lived well while they were in the wood. But on the third day they came to where it thinned, and at last died out into a stony waste, like unto that which they passed through before they came to the house of the sorceress, save that this lay in ridges as the waves of a great sea, and these same ridges there were bidden to cross over at their highest, lest they should be bewildered in a maze of little hills and dales leading no whither. So they entered on this desert, having filled their water-skins at a clear brook, whereat they rejoiced when they found that the face of the wilderness was covered with a salt scurf, and that naught grew there save a sprinkling of small sage bushes. Now on the second day of their riding this ugly waste, as they came up over the brow of one of these stony ridges, Ralph the far-sighted cried out suddenly, Hold, for I see a man weaponed. Where is he? Quoth Ursula, and what is he about? Said Ralph, He is up yonder on the swell of the next ridge, and by seeming is asleep, leaning against a rock. Then he bent the Turk bow, and set an arrow on the string, and they went on warily. When they were down at the foot of the ridge, Ralph hailed the man with a lusty cry, but gat no answer of him. So they went up the bent, till Ralph said, Now I can see his face under his helm, and it is dark, and the eyes are hollow. I will off horse and go up to him afoot, but do thou, beloved, sit still in thy saddle. But when he had come nigher, he turned and cried out to her, The man is dead! Come, anigh. So she went up to him and dismounted, and they both together stood over the man, who was lying up against a big stone like one at rest. How long he had lain there none knows but God, for in the saltness of the dry desert the flesh had dried on his bones without corrupting, and was as hardened leather. He was in full armor of a strange and ancient fashion, and his sword was girt to his side. Neither was there any sign of a wound about him. Under a crag anigh him they found his horse, dead and dry like to himself, and a little way over the brow of the ridge another horse in like case, and close by him a woman whose raiment had not utterly perished, nor her hair. There were gold rings on her arms, and her shoes were done with gold. She had a knife stuck in her breast, with her hand still clutching the handle thereof, so that it seemed that she had herself given herself death. Ralph and Ursula buried these two with heaping of stones, and went their ways. But some 2 miles thence they came upon another dead man at arms, and near him an old man unweaponed, and they heaped stones on them. Thereabout night overtook them, and it was dark. So they lay down in the waste, and comforted each other, and slept 2 or 3 hours. But they arose with the first glimmer of dawn, and mounted, and rode forth onward, that they might be sooner out of that deadly desert, for fear clung to their hearts. This day, forsooth, they found so many dead folk, that they might not stay to bury them, lest they themselves should come to lie there lacking burial. So they made all the way they might, and rode on some hours by starlight after the night was come, for it was clear and cold, so that at last they were so utterly wearied that they lay down amongst these dead folk and slept soundly. On the morrow morn Ralph awoke and saw Ursula sleeping peacefully as he deemed, and he looked about on the dreary desert and its dead men, and saw no end to it, though they lay on the top of one of those stony bents. And he said softly to himself, Will it end at all, then? Surely all this people of the days gone by were seekers of the well as we be, and have they belike turned back from somewhere further on, and might not escape the desert despite of all? Shall we turn now? Shall we turn? Surely we might get into the kindly wood from here. So he spake, but Ursula sat up, for she was not asleep, and said, The perils of the waste being abundant and exceeding hard to face, would not the sage of his books have told us of the most deadly? Said Ralph, Yet here are all these dead, and we were not told of them. Nevertheless we have seen token on the rock oft times yesterday, so we are yet in the road, unless all this hath been but a snare and a betrayal. She shook her head and was silent a little. Then she said, Ralph, my lad, didst thou see this token? And she set at hand to the beads about her neck, on any of those dead folk yesterday. Nay, said Ralph, though sooth to say I looked for it. And I likewise, she said, for indeed I had misgivings as the days grew old. But now I say, let us on in the faith of that token, and the kindness of the sage, and the love of the innocent people. Yea, and thy luck, O lad of the green fields far away, that hath brought thee unscathed so far from Upmeads. So they mounted and rode forth, and saw more and more of the dead folk, and ever and anon they looked to them to note if they wore beads like them, but saw none so dight. Then Ursula said, Yea, why should the sage and the books have told us aught of these dead bodies, that are but as the plenishing of the waste, like to the flowers that are cast down before the bier of a saint on a holy day to be trodden under foot by the churls and the vicars of the close? Forsooth, had they been alive now, the swords to smite withal, and hands to drag us into captivity, it had been another matter, but against these I feel bold. Ralph sighed and said, Yea, but even if we die in the waste, yet this is piteous, so many lives passed away, so many hopes slain. Yea, she said, but do not folk die there in the world behind us? I have seen sights far worse than this at Utterbol, little while as I was there. Moreover, I can note that this army of dead men has not come all in one day or 1 year, but in a long, long while, by 1 and 2 and 3. For hast thou noted that their raiment and war gear both is of many fashions, and some much more perish than other, long as things last in this dry waste? I say that men die as in the world beyond, but here we see them as they lie dead, and have lain for so long. He said, I fear neither the waste nor the dead men, if thou fearest not, beloved, but I lament for these poor souls. And I also, said she, therefore let us on, that we may come to those whose grief we may heal. Chapter 18. They come to the dry tree. Presently, as they rode, they had before them one of the greatest of those land waves, and they climbed it slowly, going afoot and leading their horses. But when they were but a little way from the brow, they saw over a gap thereof something, as it were huge horns rising up into the air beyond the crest of the ridge. So they marveled, and drew their swords, and held them still a while, misdoubting if this were perchance some terrible monster of the waste. But whereas the thing moved not at all, they plucked up heart and fared on. So came they to the brow, and looked over it into the valley, about which on all sides went the ridge, save where it was broken down into a narrow pass on the further side, so that they said the valley was like one of those theatres of the ancient Roman folk, whereof are some to be seen in certain lands. Neither did those desert benches lack their sitters, for all down the sides of the valley sat or lay children of men, some women, but most menfolk, of whom the more part were weaponed, and some with their drawn swords in their hands. Whatever semblance of moving was in them when the eddying wind of the valley stirred the rags of their raiment, or the long hair of the women. But a very midmost of this dreary theatre rose up a huge and monstrous tree, whose topmost branches were even the horns which they had seen from below the hill's brow. Leafless was the tree, and lacking of twigs, and its bole upheld but some 50 of great limbs, and as they looked on it, they doubted whether it were not made by men's hands rather than grown up out of the earth. All round about the roots of it was a pool of clear water, that cast back the image of the valley side and the bright sky of the desert, as though it had been a mirror of burnished steel. The limbs of that tree were all behung with blazoned shields and knights' helms and swords and spears and axes and hauberks, and it rose up into the air some 100 feet above the flat of the valley. For a while they looked down silently on this marvel. Then from both their lips at once they cry, "The dry tree!" Then Ralph thrust his sword back into his sheath and said, "Meseems I must needs go down amongst them. There is naught to do us harm here, for all these are dead like the others that we saw." Ursula turned to him with burning cheeks and sparkling eyes, and said eagerly, "Yea, yea, let us go down, else might we chance to miss something that we ought to wot of." Therewith she also sheathed her sword, and they went both of them down together, and that easily. For as aforesaid, the slope was as if it had been cut into steps for their feet. And as they passed by the dead folk, for whom they had often to turn aside, they noted that each of the dead, leathery faces was drawn up in a grin, as though they had died in pain, and yet beguiled, so that all those visages looked somewhat alike, as though they had come from the workshop of one craftsman. At last Ralph and Ursula stood on the level ground underneath the tree, and they looked up at the branches and down to the water at their feet. And now it seemed to them as though the tree had verily grown in it, for they beheld its roots, that they went out from the mound or islet of the earth into the water, and spread abroad therein, and seemed to waver about. So they walked around the tree, and looked up at the shields that hung on its branches, but saw no blazon that they knew, though there were many and diverse, and the armor also and weapons were very diverse of fashion. Now when they were come back again to the place where they had first stayed, Ralph said, "I thirst, and so belike dost thou, and here is water good and clear. Let us drink then, and so spare our water-skins, for belike the dry desert is yet long." And therewith he knelt down that he might take of the water in the hollow of his hand. But Ursula drew back, and cried out in terror, "O Ralph, do it not! Seest thou not this water, that although it be bright and clear, so that we may see all the pebbles at the bottom, yet nevertheless, when the wind eddies about, and lifts the skirts of our raiment, it makes no ripple on the face of the pool, and doubtless it is heavy with venom. And moreover, there is no sign on the way hereabout, as to other watering steads. O forbear, Ralph." Then he rose up and drew back with her, but slowly and unwillingly, as she deemed. And they stood together a while gazing on these marvels. But lo, amidst of this while, there came a crow wheeling over the valley of the dead, and he croaked over the dry tree, and let himself drop down to the edge of the pool, whereby he stalked about a little, after the manner of his kind. Then he thrust his neb into the water and drank, and thereafter took wing again. But ere he was many feet off the ground, he gave a grievous croak, and turning over in the air, fell down stark dead, close to the feet of those twain. And Ralph cried out, but spake no word with meaning therein. Then said Ursula, "Yea, thus we are saved from present death." Then she looked in Ralph's face, and turned pale, and said hastily, "O my friend, how is it with thee?" But she waited not for an answer, but turned her face to the bent whereby they had come down, and cried out in a loud shrill voice, "O Ralph, Ralph, look up yonder to the ridge whereby we left our horses. Look, look! There glitters a spear and stirreth, and lo, a helm underneath the spear. Tarry not, let us save our horses." Then Ralph let out a cry from his mouth, and set off running to the side of the slope, and fell to climbing it with great strides, not heeding Ursula. But she followed close after, and scrambled up with foot and hand and knee, till she stood beside him on the top, and he looked around wildly, and cried out, "Where? Where are they?" "Nowhere," she said. "It was not but my word to draw thee from death. But praise to the saints that thou art come alive out of the cursed valley." He seemed not to hearken, but turned about once and beat the air with his hands, and then he fell down on his back, and with a great wail she cast herself upon him, for she deemed at first that he was dead. But she took a little water from one of their skins and cast it into his face. Then took she a flask of cordial from her pouch, and set it to his lips, and made him drink somewhat thereof. So in a while he came to himself, and opened his eyes and smiled upon her, and she took his head into her hands and kissed his cheek. And he sat up and said feebly, "Shall we not go down into the valley?" There is naught there to harm us." "We have been down there already," she said, "and well it is that we are not both lying there now." Then he got to his feet and stretched himself, and yawned like one just awakened from long sleep. But she said, "Let us to horse, and be gone. It is early hours to slumber, for those that are seeking the well at the world's end." He smiled on her again and took her hand, and she led him to his horse and helped him till he was in the saddle, and lightly she got a horseback, and they rode away swiftly from that evil place, and after a while Ralph was himself again, and remembered all that had happened, till he fell down on the brow of the ridge. Then he praised Ursula's wisdom and valiancy till she bade him forbear lest he weary her, albeit she drew up close to him and kissed his face sweetly. Chapter 19. They come out of the thirsty desert. Past the valley of the dry tree, they saw but few dead men lying about, and soon they saw never another. And though the land was still utterly barren, and all cast up into ridges as before, yet the salt slime grew less and less, and before nightfall of that day they had done with it. And the next day those stony waves were lower, and the next again the waste was but a swelling plain. And here and there they came on patches of dwarf willow, and other harsh and scanty herbage, whereof the horses might have a bait, which they sore needed. For now was their fodder done. But both men and horses were sore athirst, for as carefully as they had hoarded their water, there was now but little left, which they durst not drink till they were driven perforce, lest they should yet die of drought. They journeyed long that day, and whereas the moon was up at night tide, they lay not down till she was set, and their resting place was by some low bushes, whereabout was rough grass mingled with willow herb, whereby Ralph judged that they drew nigh to water. So or ever they slept, they and the horses all but emptied the water-skins. They heard some sort of beast roaring in the night, but they were too weary to watch, and might not make a fire. When Ralph awoke in the morning, he cried out that he could see the woodland, and Ursula arose at his cry and looked where he pointed. And sure enough there were trees on a rising ground some 2 miles ahead, and beyond them, not very far by seeming, they beheld the tops of great dark mountains. On either hand, moreover, nigh on their right hand, far off on their left, ran a reef of rocks, so that their way seemed to be between 2 walls. And these said reefs were nowise like those that they had seen of late, but black, and as to their matter, like to the great mountains by the rock of the Fighting Man. But as the reefs ran eastward, they seemed to grow higher. Now they mounted their horses at once and rode on, and the beasts were as eager as they were, and belike smelt the water. So when they had ridden but 3 miles, they saw a fair little river before them, winding about exceedingly, but flowing eastward on the whole. So they spurred on with light hearts, and presently were on the banks of the said river. And its waters were crystal clear, though its sands were black, and the pink-blossomed willow herb was growing abundantly on the sandy shores. Close to the water was a black rock, as big as a man, whereon was graven the signs of the way. So they knew that there was no evil in the water, wherefore they drank their fill and watered their horses abundantly. And on the further bank was there abundance of good grass. So when they had drunk their fill, for the pleasure of the cool water, they waded the ford barefoot, and it was scarce above Ursula's knees. Then they had great joy to lie on the soft grass and eat their meat, while the horses tore eagerly at the herbage close to them. So when they had eaten, they rested a while. But before they went further, they despoiled them, one after other, and bathed in a pool of the river to wash the foul wilderness off them. Then again they rested, and let the horses yet bite the grass, and departed not from that pleasant place till it was 2 hours after noon. As they were lying there, Ralph said he could hear a great roar like the sound of many waters, but very far off. But to Ursula it seemed not but the wind waxing in the boughs of the woodland anigh them. Chapter 20. They come to the ocean sea. Being come to the wood, they went not very far into it that day, for they were minded to rest them after the weariness of the wilderness. They feasted on a hare which Ralph shot, and made a big fire to keep off evil beasts. But none came nigh them, though they heard the voices of certain beasts as the night grew still. To be short, they slept far into the morrow's morn, and then being refreshed, and their horses also, they rode strongly all day, and found the woods to be not very great. For before sunset they were come to its outskirts, and the mountains lay before them. These were but little like to that huge wall they had passed through on their way to the chestnut dale, being rather great hills than mountains, grass-grown, and at their feet somewhat wooded, and by seeming not over hard to pass over. The next day they entered them by a pass marked with a token, which led them about by a winding way till they were on the side of the biggest fell of all. So there they rested that night in a fair little hollow or dell in the mountain-side. There in the stillness of the night both Ursula as well as Ralph heard that roaring of great water, and they said to each other that it must be the voice of the sea. And they rejoiced thereat, for they had learned by the sage in his books that they must needs come to the verge of the ocean sea, which girdles the earth about. So they arose betimes on the morrow, and set to work to climb the mountain, going mostly afoot. And the way was long, but not craggy or exceeding steep, so that in 5 hours' time they were at the mountain top, and coming over the brow they beheld beneath them fair green slopes, besprinkled with trees, and beyond them, some 3 or 4 miles away, the blue landless sea. And on either hand of them was the sea also, so that they were nigh hand at the ending of a great ness, and there was naught beyond it, and naught to do if they missed the well, but to turn back by the way they had come. Now when they saw this, they were exceedingly moved, and they looked on one another, and each saw that the other was pale with glistening eyes, since they were to come to the very point of their doom, and that it should be seen whether there was no such thing as the well in all the earth, but that they had been chasing a fair-hued cloud, or else their quest should be achieved, and they should have the world before them, and they happy and mighty, and of great worship amidst all men. Little they tarried, but gat them down the steep of the mountain, and so lower and lower till they were come to the ground nigh level. And then at last it was but thus, that without any great rock wall or girdle of marvellous and strange land, there was an end of earth, with its grass and trees and streams, and a beginning of the ocean, which stretched away changeless, and it might be forever. Where the land ended there was but a cliff of less than 100 feet above the eddying of the sea, and on the very point of the ness was a low green toft with a square stone set atop it, whereon they drew nigh, they saw the token graven, yea, on each face thereof. Then they went along the edge of the cliff, a mile on each side of the said toft, and then finding naught else to note, naught save the grass and the sea, they came back to the place of the token, and sat down on the grass of the toft. It was now evening, and the sun was setting beyond them, but they could behold a kind of stair cut into the side of the cliff, and on the first step whereof was the token done. Wherefore they knew that they were bidden to go down by the said stair, but it seemed to lead no whither, save straight into the sea. And whiles it came into Ralph's mind that this was naught but a mock, as if to bid the hapless seekers cast themselves down from the earth, and be done with it forever. But in any case they might not try the adventure of the stair by the failing light, and with the night long before them. So when they had hoppled their horses, and left them to graze at their will on the sweet grass of the meadow, they laid them down behind the green toft, and being forewearied, it was no long time ere they twain slept fast at the uttermost end of the world. Chapter 21. Now they drink of the well at the world's end. Ralph awoke from some foolish morning dream of Upmeads, wondering where he was, or what familiar voice had cried out his name. Then he raised himself on his elbow and saw Ursula standing before him with flushed face and sparkling eyes, and she was looking out seaward, while she called out his name. So he sprang up and strove with the slumber that still hung about him, and as his eyes cleared, he looked down and saw that the sea, which last night had washed the face of the cliff, had now ebbed far out, and left bare betwixt the billows and the cliff, had now ebbed far out, and left bare betwixt the billows and the cliff some half-mile of black sand, with rocks of the like hue rising out of it here and there. But just below the place where they stood, right up against the cliff, was builded by man's hand of huge stones a garth of pound, the wall whereof was some 7 feet high, and the pound within the wall of 40 feet space and long and overthwart. And the said pound was filled with waters of a spring that came forth from the face of the cliff, as they deemed, though from above they might not see the issue thereof. And the water ran seaward by the pound by some unway seen, and made a wide stream through the black sand of the foreshore. But ever the great basin filled somewhat faster than it voided, so that it ran over the lip on all sides, making a thin veil over the huge ashlar stones of the garth. The day was bright and fair, with no wind, save light airs playing about from the westward ort, and all things gleamed and glittered in the sun. Ralph stood still a moment, and then stretched abroad his arms, and with a great sob he cast them round about the body of his beloved, and strained her to his bosom as he murmured about her, "The well at the world's end," that she wept for joy as she fawned upon him and let her hands beat upon his body. When they were somewhat calmed of their ecstasy of joy, they made ready to go down by that rocky stair, and first they did off their armor and other gear. And when they were naked, they did on the hallowed raiment, which they had out of the ark and the house of the sorceress, and so clad gat them down the rock-hewn stair, Ralph going first, lest there should be any broken place, but naught was amiss with those hard black stones, and they came safely to a level place of the rock, whence they could see the face of the cliff, and how the waters of the well came gushing forth from a hollow therein, in a great swelling wave as clear as glass, and the sun glistened in it and made a foam bow about its edges. But above the issue of the waters, the black rock had been smoothed by man's art, and thereon was graven the sword in the bow, and above it these words, to wit, "Ye who have come a long way to look upon me, drink of me, if ye deem that ye be strong enough and desire to bear length of days, or else drink not, but tell your friends and the kindred of the earth how you have seen a great marvel." So they looked long and wondered, and Ursula said, "Deemest thou, my friend, that any have come thus far and forborne to drink?" Said Ralph, "Surely not. Even the exceeding wise might remember the bitterness of his wisdom as he stood here." Then he looked on her, and his face grew bright beyond measure, and cried out, "O love, love, why tarry we? For yet I fear lest we be come too late, and thou die before mine eyes ere yet thou hast drunken." "Yea," she said, "and I also fear for thee, though thy face is ruddy and thine eyes sparkle, and thou art as lovely as the captain of the Lord's hosts." Then she laughed, and her laughter was as silver bells rung tunably, and she said, "But where is the cup for the drinking?" Ralph looked on the face of the wall, and about height of his hand saw square marks thereon, as though there were an amber, and amidst the square was a knop of latten, all green with the weather and the salt spray. So Ralph set his hand on the knop and drew strongly, and lo, it was a door made of a squared stone hung on brazen hinges, and it opened easily to him, and within was a cup of goldsmith's work, with the sword and the bow done thereon, and round about the rim writ with poesy, "The strong of heart shall drink from me." So Ralph took it and held it aloft so that its pure metal flashed in the sun, and he said, "This is for thee, sweetling." "Yea, and for thee," she said. Now that level place or bench table went up to the very gushing and green bow of the water. So Ralph took Ursula's hand and led her along, she going a little after him, till he was very close to the well, and stood amidst the spray bow thereof. He looked verily like one of the painted angels on the choir wall of St. Lawrence of Upmeads. Then he reached forth his hand and thrust the cup into the water, holding it stoutly, because the gush of the stream was strong, so that the water of the well splashed all over him, wetting Ursula's face and breast withal. And he felt that the water was sweet, without any saltness of the sea. But he turned to Ursula and reached out the full cup to her and said, "Sweetling, call a health over the cup." She took it and said, "To thy life, beloved," and drank withal, and her eyes looked out of the cup the while, like a child's when he drinketh. Then she gave him the cup and said, Drink, and tarry not, lest thou die and I live. Then Ralph plunged the cup into the waters again, and he held the cup aloft and cried out, To the earth and the world of manfolk. And therewith he drank. For a minute they clung together with the spray bow of the well. And then she took his hand and led him back to the midst of the bench table, and he put the cup into the amber and shut it up again. And then they sat them down on the widest of the platform under the shadow of a jutting rock, for the sun was hot, and therewithal a sweet weariness began to steal over them, though there was speech betwixt them for a little. And Ralph said, How is it with thee, beloved? Oh, well indeed, she said. Quoth he, And how tasteth to thee the water of the well? Slowly she spake and sleepily, It tasted good, and as if thy love were blended with it. And she smiled in his face, but he said, One thing I wonder over, and how shall we wot if we have drunk aright? For whereas if we were sick or old and failing, or ill-liking, and were now presently healed of all this, and become strong and fair to look on, then should we know it for sure. But now, though as I look on thee, I behold thee the fairest of all women, and on thy face is no token of toil and travail and the weariness of the way, and though the heartache of loneliness and captivity and the shame of Utterbol has left no mark upon thee, yet hast thou not always been sweet to my eyes, and as sweet as might be. And how then— But he broke off and looked on her, and she smiled upon the love in his eyes, and his head fell back, and he slept with a calm and smiling face, and she leaned over him to kiss his face. But even therewith her own eyes closed, and she laid her head upon his breast, and slept as peacefully as he. Chapter 22. Now they have drunk and are glad. Long they slept till the shadows were falling from the west, and the sea was flowing fast again over the sands beneath them, though there was still a great space bare betwixt the cliff and the sea. Then spake Ursula, as if Ralph had but just left speaking, and she said, Yea, dear lord, and I also say that, lovely as thou art now, never hast thou been aught else but lovely to me. But tell me, hast thou had any scar of a hurt upon thy body? For if now that were gone, surely it should be a token of the renewal of thy life. But if it be not gone, then there may yet be another token. Then he stood up upon his feet, and she cried out, Oh, but thou art fair and mighty! Who now shall dare gainsay thee? Who shall not long for thee? Said Ralph, Look, love, how the sea comes over the sand like the creeping of a sly wood-snake. Shall we go hence and turn from the ocean sea without wetting our bodies in its waters? Let us go, she said. So they went down onto the level sands, and along the edges of the sweet-water stream that flowed from the well, and Ralph said, Beloved, I will tell thee of that which thou hast asked me. When I was but a lad of 16 winters, there rode men a-lifting into Upmeads, and Nicholas Longshanks, who was a wise man of war, gathered force and went against them, and I must needs ride beside him. Now we came to our above, and put the thieves to the road, but in the hurley I got claw from the war-beast, but the stroke of a sword sheared me off somewhat from my shoulder. Belike thou hast seen the scar, and I loathed it. It is not loathsome, she said, for a lad to be a bold warrior, nor for a grown man to think lightly of the memory of death drawn near for the first time. Yea, I have noted it, but let me see what has befallen with it. As she spoke, they were come to a salt pool in a rocky bight on their right hand, which the tide was filling speedily, and Ralph spake, See now, this is the bath of the water of the ocean sea. So they were speedily naked and playing in the water, and Ursula took Ralph by the arm and looked to his shoulder and said, O my lad of the pale edges, where is gone thy glory? There is no mark of the sword's pilgrimage on thy shoulder. Nay, none? Quoth he. None, none, she said. Didst thou say the very sooth of thy hurt in the battle? O poor lad of mine? Yea, the sooth, said he. Then she laughed sweetly and merrily, like the chuckle of a flute over the rippling waters that rose higher and higher about them. And she turned her eyes askance, and looked adown to her own sleek side, and laid her hand on it, and laughed again. Then said Ralph, "What is toward, beloved? For thy laugh is rather of joy than of mirth alone." She said, "O smooth-skinned warrior, O lily and rose of battle, here on my side yesterday was the token of the heart's tyne that gored me when I was young maiden 5 years ago. Look, now the pity maiden that lay on the grass of the forest, and the woodman a passing by deemed her dead 5 years ago." Ralph stooped down as the ripple washed away from her, then said, "In sooth, here is no mark nor blemish, but the best handiwork of God, as when he first made a woman from the side of the ancient father of the field of damask. But lo, you love, how swift the tide cometh up, and I long to see thy feet on the green grass. I fear the sea, lest it stir the joy over strongly in our hearts, and we be not able to escape from its waves." So they went up from out of the water, and did on the hallowed raiment, fragrant with strange herbs, and passed joyfully up the sand towards the cliff and its stair. And speedily withal, for soon they were clad again, the little ripple of the sea was nigh touching their feet. As they went, they noted that the waters of the well flowed seaward from the black-walled pound by the 3 arch openings in its outer face. And they beheld the mason's work, how goodly it was, for it was as if it had been cut out of the foot of a mountain. So well jointed were its stones, and its walls solid against any storm that might drive against it. They climbed the stair and sat them down on the green grass a while, watching the ocean coming in over the sand and the rocks. And Ralph said, "I will tell thee, sweetling, that I am grown eager for the road. Though true it is that whiles I was down yonder, amidst the ripple of the sea, I longed for naught but thee, though thou wert beside me, and thy joyous words were as fire to the heart of my love. But now that I am on the green grass of the earth, I call to mind a dream that came to me when we slept after the precious draught of the well. For methought that I was standing before the porch of the feast hall of Upmeads, and holding thy hand. And the ancient house spake to me with the voice of a man, greeting both thee and me, and praising thy goodliness and valiancy. Surely then it is calling me to deeds, and it were but morning, as it now drawing toward sunset, we would mount and be gone straightway." "Surely," she said, "thou hast drunk of the well, and the fear of thee has already entered into the hearts of thy foemen far away, even as the love of thee constraineth me as I lie by thy side. But since it is evening and sunset, let it be evening, and let the morning see its own matters. So now let us be pilgrims again, and eat the meal of pilgrims, and see to our horses, and then wander about this lovely wilderness and its green meads, where no son of man heedeth the wild things, till the night come, bringing to us the rest and the sleep of them that have prevailed over many troubles." Even so they did. They broke bread over the sea, and looked to their horses, and then went hand in hand about the goodly green bents betwixt the sea and the rough of the mountain. And it was the fairest and softest of summer evenings, and the deer of that place, both little and great, had no fear of man. But the hart and hind came to Ursula's hand, and the thrushes perched upon her shoulder, and the hares gambolled together close to the feet of the twain, so that it seemed to them that they had come into the very garden of God. And they forgat all the many miles of the waste and the mountain that lay before them, and they had no thought for the strife of foemen and the thwarting of kindred that belike awaited them in their own land, but they thought of the love and happiness of the hour that was passing. So sweetly they wore through the last minutes of the day, and when it was as dark as it would be in that fair season, they lay down by the green knoll at the ending of the land, and were lulled to sleep by the bubbling of the well at the world's end. This is the end of Book 3 of The Well at the World's End, a tale by William Morris. In the next video, we will proceed to Book 4, entitled The Road Home. Thank you for listening.